Welcome, welcome, full house, to the Joukowsky Institute for Archaeology in the Ancient World. Welcome to Brown University. My name is Sue Alcock, and I'm the Institute's director. And I must say that one of the chief pleasures of this post is this, a moment like this, the chance to gather friends, old friends, new friends, the chance to observe students becoming colleagues, and colleagues becoming I was actually going to say gray, including myself. Now let me just give you a little context on what we're up to here tonight and tomorrow. For 2 years now, a combination of faculty and graduate students in the Institute have organized these workshops entitled State of the Field X, with X being a particular country or region where there was in that year at the Institute sort of a critical mass of interest, talent, and concerns. 2 years ago was Italy. Last year was Turkey. This year, of course, we turned to Greece, and so far North Africa is in the running for next. Now, the basic idea with all of these was to sort of convene a space, a place, where we could consider big questions, next directions in archaeological practice, thinking both in terms of periods and period-specific issues, and also in terms of practices and methodologies, new developments. And that's how we've organized tomorrow's sessions, morning and afternoon. I will say that the goal is very much to keep the emphasis on dialogue and on sharing, to make this as open an event as possible. So please do not hang back, speak up, and above all, I would say revel in the most amazing lineup of participants that we have before us. Now, I want to thank, well, many people, but for tonight I'll stick with the dynamic trio who pulled this event together. Sylvian Fachard, raise your hand. All right. Alex Nodell, raise your hand. And Fotini Condili, raise your hand. If you have any problems, talk to them. All right. Right. My role is now almost complete. I will simply invite Sylvian Fachard to come up and introduce our keynote speaker. Sylvian.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks for coming. As Sue said, my name is Sylvian Fachard, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at the Joukowsky Institute. We're very happy tonight to welcome tonight's speaker, Vassilis Aravantinos. Dr. Aravantinos has many titles and many laurel crowns. Doctor, Professor, Effer Emeritus. When I asked him which of them he was most comfortable with, he very modestly told me that he's known amongst colleagues as O Vassilis. To many of us, working in Greece, of course, Dr. Aravantinos is known as the Effer of prehistoric and classical antiquities of Boeotia and the director of the Thebes Archaeological Museum, a position he held between 1993 and 2011. In Boeotia, Dr. Aravantinos has also promoted scientific research and collaboration, going out of his way to accommodate Greek and foreign archaeologists. He has directed, co-directed, and overseen a wide variety of archaeological excavations, epigraphic studies, and surveys, making Boeotia one of the best researched regions in all of Greece. Dr. Aravantinos studied at the universities of Athens and Rome, where he completed his PhD thesis in Philologia Mycenaea, Mycenaean philology. He was a research fellow at the Italian National Research Council, focusing on Mycenaean archaeology, with particular emphasis on Linear B script, under the direction of Professor Anna Sacconi. He also worked at the collection of Egyptian antiquities at the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, and became a curator in the Archaeological Service in the Hellenic Ministry of Culture in 1980. Before assuming the position of Effer, Dr. Aravantinos worked at the Effort of Boeotia as a curator between 1981 and 1993, getting an unconventional start with his first day on the morning after the terrible earthquake of 1981. In this part of the world, Dr. Aravantinos was a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute for Research in the Humanities of the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1987-1988, later becoming assistant professor. He was also a fellow at the Institute of Classical Studies, University College London, under the sponsorship of Nicholas Coldstream. In Italy, he has taught Aegean archaeology at the universities of Chieti, Urbino, and Naples. He was appointed full professor of Aegean prehistory in 2001, but kept his position at Thebes. His publications and contributions to the field of Greek archaeology are far too many to be listed here, but I will nonetheless attempt to provide just a small sample. For fieldwork, he has conducted extensive excavation and research in some of Greece's most prominent sites: Argos, Nafplion, Epidavros, Mycenae, Thebes, Coronea, Plataea, Medeon, Eleon, Charonea, and Orchomenos. In 1993, he started excavating sections of the Mycenaean palace at Thebes, unearthing what would become soon one of the most significant Linear B archives in the Aegean. Dr. Aravantinos is currently the director of the systematic excavations of the Cadmea, undertaken by the Athens Archaeological Society and in collaboration with the Ministry of Culture, and expect to hear much more in the following 5 years about this excavation. Dr. Aravantinos has published some 200 articles and books. Let me just highlight that he's the author and co-editor with Louis Godard and Annie Sacconi of the 4-volume series Fouilles de la Cadmée, Les Tablettes de l'Odos Pelopidou. He recently published a lavish and thorough monograph entitled The Archaeological Museum of Thebes, which joins the Lazzi series dedicated to the museums of Greece. Don't be misguided by the title. This last monograph is not an archaeological guide to the museum. It's really a unique diachronic journey into the material culture of Boeotia. And let me just add here that it's available online for consultation. And it's a great pleasure to have him here now for tonight's lecture, Archaeologies of Greece, Past, Present, and Future, the Case of Thebes. Please join me in welcoming Professor Aravantinos.
Thank you, Sylvian. Thank you all. Ladies, it's open or not? Oh, not needed. Ladies and gentlemen, dear students, colleagues, and friends, it is my pleasure and honor to address you in this international conference, sharing with you my long years experience, but I fear a few modest new ideas. The subject is indeed multifold and multifaceted, deserving to be discussed on afterwards in depth and in a much wider framework by the experts and the academic teachers here present, much more qualified than me. Thank you for the occasion you offered me to lecture about the archaeology of Thebes, in Thebes, from a somehow new point of view. First of all, I would like to thank the organizing committee and this prestigious institute. You honored me with your kind invitation, hospitality, and I hope I will not disappoint you. I have already expressed my gratitude before leaving Europe to Dr. Sylvian Fassard and to Mrs. Diana Richardson. Now, I'm so glad to see you, to see Jack, to see Malcolm, to see Brian, to see everyone, friends from many times. My only credential for this evening lecture is my 32 years long presence in Boeotia, one essential central area of ancient and modern Greek world. It is a common topic that Thebes constituted in the past still continues to be a unique experimental observatory and a challenge for Greek archaeology. From the beginning of the last century up to today, archaeological in Thebes was carried out almost exclusively by Greek archaeologists acting on behalf of the Athens Archaeological Society or the State Archaeological Service. With your kind permission, I would like to acknowledge my gratitude to all of my predecessors in Thebes, of course, not all alive, especially to extend my thanks to Dr. Spiros Iakovidis, who, as my teacher in Athens University, oriented my studies in Thebes, perfectly aware of its importance. Another historical figure of Greek archaeology, the late Dr. Nikos Gialouris, appointed and sent me as curator at Thebes, where I assumed my position the day after the furious earthquake of February 24, 1981, whose epicenter was in the Alcyonid Islands off the Boeotian coast in the Gulf of Corinth. Usually they say that if one arrives after an earthquake, it's a very lucky archaeology somewhere. Plenty of water has since then flowed into the stream of Greek and especially Theban archaeology that will concern us here. Indeed, my lecture will concentrate on a critical overview of archaeological activity which covers more than a century at Thebes, a Greek city for which there is no need of introductions. Over the last 30 years, one of my principal targets was to elucidate the Mycenaean Palatial period, which was traditionally believed to correspond to or simply to be reflected in Thebes' rich mythical background. It is certainly for this reason that Mycenaean Thebes was expected by the first excavators to prove the veracity of Greek myths and was considered a promised land for archaeological discoveries. We know that Heinrich Schliemann included Thebes in his application list of excavations which were never taken up either before or after his works at Mycenae. Yes. It seems that the visit he paid to the town in 1880 on his way to Orchomenos in the company of his young wife Sophia, both had a very uncomfortable night in the local inn, discouraged them from planning a possible excavation in the city citadel, the renowned Cadmea. Thebes, the third great power, who gloriously won classical Greece's hegemony, even for a few years, was very important in myth or history, in Attic tragedy, as well as in the rest of Athens-centered tradition and propaganda. It figured as the Antipolis, while its name's similarity to the Egyptian one, known also to Homer, was in fact a fiction. You can see the name here, difficult really to decipher, but it is deciphered, and the site and the name of Boeotian Thebes, which we see there, were preserved and altered since the late Bronze Age through modern times. At the time of declaration of the first Greek state's independence, the eternal symbols of the struggle to death for freedom were searched in Sparta, of course, and Thebes. The fatal resistance and sacrifice of the 300 hoplites of Leonidas at Thermopylae and of the 300 Theban warriors of the sacred band at Heronia constituted the two peak moments of ancient Greek history and resembled after 23 centuries the defenders of Alamana and Maniaki. The first investigations of the Athens Archaeological Society and the Archaeological Service in Boeotia, and especially in Thebes, were initiated in the third decade of the 19th century. 1837. Towards the end of the 19th century, excavations were already being carried out by the French on Mount Pton, at Castro Gla in the Copais, Thespies and the Valley of the Muses of course by French, and by the Germans at Calvirio, and later on at Orchomenos, and finally by the Americans at Platea, Thisvi, and Antedon. Within the context of a turbulent socio-political environment prevailing in Greece in 1897, it was attempted to excavate some of the Mycenaean chamber tombs at Thebes, which were literally evacuated by looters who had already visited the rich cemeteries Tanagra and of other Boeotian cities. Later, the first investigation by Adonios Geramopoulos, see here in the Old Museum of Thebes, at Thebes should be placed within the same context, still representing, as I have stressed on a past occasion, Greek heroic archaeology. The beginning of the 20th century was also a time of major political issues in Greece, as well as a period of high hopes and great struggle for the liberation of still occupied areas. Macedonia, Epirus, Keramopoulos was a Macedon, Crete and the islands of northern and eastern Aegean. It was also the time of great archaeological discoveries in almost all countries facing the Mediterranean and hosted ancient civilizations around the sea. And at that time, excavations were being carried out in Crete under the direction of Sir Arthur Evans, who turned Aegean prehistory into a special academic discipline with its own chronological division in 1905, as you know. The case of Mycenaean Thebes is probably the most characteristic small-scale representation of pioneer research into the ancient Greek world, where mythology was walked in parallel with the evidence and has been considered to be inter pares to the archaeological data. The first circumstantial or scheduled excavations at Thebes followed the model set by Mycenae and Knossos, but the means were fewer, and even fewer were the future perspectives. The excavator himself admits that he acted on the basis of experience and with the guidance of Pausanias and the tragic poets, and that he had three main goals. First, the discovery of the cities, mythical fortifications and gates, the excavation of the tombs of the mythical heroes, and the discovery of the city's famous palace, which the ancient poetic tradition had praised and legends had associated with Cadmus's mythical house and his daughter Semele's chamber. We see fortifications. Excavations of that time truly revealed some parts of Cadmeia's Mycenaean fortifications, albeit small and then related to each other. But royal tombs, however, similar to the tholos of Mycenae and Orchomenos, never came to light either then or later. Finally, the odd and famous building at the site of the public market did not share the features of mainland or Cretan palaces, as then was stated. According to ancient beliefs and myths, Cadmus built Thebes, so it is written on a 2nd century BC heroic Skyphos from Tanagra, the association of the prehistoric world with classical antiquity through the epics and mythology, as well as the reproduction of outdated and biased interpretations, were the main means for converting Aegean prehistory into a familiar temporal and spatial landscape. Today, after decades of excavations and studies, Thebes can at last offer us all the necessary finds and interpretation tools that the research of a major, long-lasting settlement center could offer. By using all these tools, modern archaeology, freed now from ancient myths and new dogmas, aims to articulate a new interpretative approach and to introduce new prospects for the future of the city's past. The purpose of archaeological work is interpretation, and the value of our discoveries is completed when material is taken out of its quantitative and raw state and placed within a synthetic text. The evaluating old interpretations by confronting old problems with new ideas and new ways of understanding occupies a central place in the field of archaeology. In historical times, traditions and legends were created in relation to certain building remains which were still visible and were linked generally and vaguely to heroes of epics and tragic plays, as they were enriched with plenty of anachronisms. Thus, certain huge stones in the area of the museum impressed Pausanias, who took them as credible evidence for the walls that Amphion's music had built. However, the old issue of Thebes' Mycenaean fortifications remained for years unanswered because of lack of satisfying evidence. It has been proved today that in Thebes Mycenaean fortifications truly existed and have been located, as you see, at many spots of the citadel. Since 1984, archaeological research, and only that, has uncovered several strong, sturdy parts of the fortifications' stone foundations, datable to Palatial times, 1400 to 1200 BC, and comparable to other contemporary ones, as we observed, for example, with late Professor Klaus Kilian at Tiryns, and I suggested to Brian Burns for Eleon. Mycenaean fortifications, even if they differ in structural details, depending on local conditions, are characterized by certain clear and standard features. They are comparable to other citadel walls found in a wider geographical area, first in Boeotia, then in central Greece, of course, and in Peloponnese, and finally in the Hittites' land in Asia Minor. They stood upon strong fortifications of differing width and consistent of tall superstructure built of mud bricks. Foundations, buttresses, and bastions, gates or side ports, and finally the remains of mud bricks were discovered during excavations conducted by myself and other colleagues in the eastern and southern side of the ancient citadel, and at the site of the museum also. In the past, they were found in its western steep slope. A recent reconstruction of the walls of Hattusas, the Hittites' capital, give us a good idea of Mycenaean fortification too. But here I saw reconstruction, virtual one of Thebes, not of Hattusas. You can find them in a special book by the Germans, no problem. They indeed reached great heights, as rightly diagnosed by the excavator and restoration experts at Mycenae and Tiryns, for example. Professor Milonas first told it, that the parts of the fortification walls which are now possible to trace at Thebes and which we see in virtual reconstruction made it possible to follow the citadel's outline independently of the number and location of its gates, which is rather a matter of speculation. The walls that protected the huge citadel and the numerous administrative bureaucrats of the palatial system were destroyed and buried under the debris at the end of the palatial period, somewhat before or after 1200 BC. The prospects of discovering more parts of the Theban walls are today high. as also great are the difficulties of such an attempt. On the contrary, virtual reality or the walls partial reconstruction, real reconstruction, would offer a safe and useful picture of the most renowned and characteristic feature of Mycenaean Thebes. Another major issue concerning Mycenaean Thebes has always been the lack of monumental tombs dated in palatial times. At the same time, there is also lack of a final publication of the city's Mycenaean cemeteries known from excavations, while the prospects of looking for and excavating new great burial monuments seem at present to be very few and unfavorable. An answer to this question is the first study conducted as part of the project on the Mycenaean cemeteries of Thebes, funded by INSTAB, ancient tradition, and mainly its modern interpretation have today's valueness, myth, and history. Besides, practiced in some of the from archaic, some of them into cult of unknown today figures by offering figurines and cooking that were related to sacrifice, while inscriptions on Valley and Dipinti, the word hero or anetheken dedicated to heroic cult. Real, of course, from Heracles, but it's also from Mycenaean, the expression anetheken. Were identified in the sanctuaries found outside the Electran Cathedral. The Castelia, fully studied, while it is important chamber by Thebes, and perhaps the most of Greece because of things. It is indeed with to a certain building during the tomb was extended of our project for paintings, finding also no evidence barely surviving to one. It therefore seems that the female figure is probably not a mourner of the type known to us from the repertoire of the Tanagra Larnakes, as assumed until now, but an adorant, possibly standing in front of a cult structure in a characteristic posture of Aegean art. The perspectives for further reconstructions in the future are small, but the incomplete today painting probably included other figures too. And much could be said on the great tomb's architecture, with a chamber measuring 11 meters and more, per 7, per 3.5, and the dromos 25 meters long, 10 tall, and so on, worthy of a sui generis royal monument. Solely on the basis of the architectural data and later transformations, this monument could be regarded as a royal tomb representing the almost 200 years old ruling power of the Mycenaean kings of Thebes. It should be stressed here, however, since this is usually not mentioned, that this chamber tomb is not the single large or wall-painted tomb in this particular cemetery or in the rest of mainland Greece. Its differences from other similar tombs are apparently quantitative and qualitative, or simply local. It is still, however, the largest of all known chamber tombs and the better preserved one, while the assumptions for unknown, possibly Tholos tombs in Thebes are based on argumenta e silentio. Today, it is obvious and at the same time very interesting that at Castelli we have a Siamese burial monument deliberately constructed at different historical moments. The theory that the more recent Eastern tomb was dug because of wrong calculations and accidentally fell upon the pre-existing one large chamber seems rather unlikely. The same is true for the initial well-known hypothesis that the monument had two dromoi because it supposedly received the burial of the two dead brothers, Eteocles and Polynices, who died at the same moment. The initial western tomb with the bends carved on the rock and the pitched roof was exceptionally monumental, as in general all early palatial, Mycenaean palatial works. Later on, perhaps during the years of the impending crisis of the 13th century BC, a little before or after the middle of the century, a second dromos was dug and the chamber with the simple sloping roof was opened. It was then that the initial floor and the western part of the united tombs were buried under deposits. The benches and the right door jamb of the new entrance were built to a greater height. The first entrance was built in, and the unified space was wall painted. The view, therefore, of a single tomb with a twin dromos is proved wrong by the excavation data and construction evidence, since this is in fact a case of a new layout applied to the older ruler's tomb. The finds from the monumental tomb were few but useful for the dating and evaluation of the tomb's status. What was left behind by ancient and modern looters is a small precious pyxis made of ivory, decorated with a sheen of heraldic sphinxes, a true object of prestige. The lid of a similar object was found in a neighboring chamber tomb. The hypothesis that Mycenaean kings were buried here, given the preeminence of the conspicuous hill and tomb as compared to others is compatible with its form and seems historically valid and strong. Another, however, hypothesis that the mythical and tragic dynasty of Laios was buried here, as well as with the cursed children of Oedipus, in combination with Pausanias' reference, is not based on logical arguments. Besides the following puzzle, twin dromoi, two dead persons, therefore the two fratricides who alternatively killed each other according to Theban mythology, owes its existence to the usual way of manipulating mythical references appearing in ancient texts. Pausanias' reference to a monument dedicated to the two fratricides of Theban mythology is vague. The traveler's enigmatic information, as correctly rejected by Sachter, as often based on inexact narrations and local antiquarians, his informers. However, the constant attempt of some scholars, not only Greeks, since 1900 onwards, to correlate prehistoric data with extracts from the body of ancient literature, presenting them as historical sources, led to certain interpretations of many aspects of the Mycenaean society that are either outdated or biased. The latter is valid and true for the case of the unearthed so far remains of the Mycenaean palace, which were overshadowed by a quasi-historical and semi-mythological approach directly connecting mythology with the prehistoric past, reproducing the historical philological tradition of the Romantic era of Greek prehistoric archaeology. The most crucial issue concerning Theban archaeology has always been the Mycenaean palace, which is the last to be examined here. It is indeed the most thorny issue, but also at the same time the most current and attractive problem, and offers us the greatest and most tangible prospects for the future archaeology of Thebes. Keramopoulos was the first to occupy himself with this problem, while admitting his empirical, almost simplistic method of approaching complex problems of the palaces, excavations, and interpretation. Another, after him, since 1960 onwards, Greek archaeologists, the excavators of Thebes, were always concerned with the issue. It is indeed true that the case of the Theban palace, here we see the armory, a piece excavated in the 60s, never became one of international character, despite some exceptional attempts in the 60s with Edith Porada and in the 70s with John Chadwick. This attempt to internationalize the issue of the palace's excavation during the dictatorship years in Greece was not sincere and should be placed within the context of that time's grand and pompous declarations, usually ending into events destined simply for showing off. Lately, however, since the 90s, this big issue has started to be placed upon a new base and in right dimensions. The aforementioned approaches, which to an extent remain valid in Greek archaeology, continuing to undermine interpretation based on excavation data, must be nowadays completely abandoned. A recent, however, attempt in 2000, so on, to plan Thebes archaeological research on a modern, scientific, and common base, moved by the interest of the Packard Humanities Institute, sunk into the shallow and blurry waters of ministerial bureaucracy without ever having set sail. Today, the case's status questionis is encouraging and future prospects are better. Some rays of light have started to appear lately at the end of the tunnel of Theban archaeology after many years of excavations, recordings, studies, and other developments and efforts. The palace's systematic exploration was included only last year in the program of the Athens Archaeological Society in cooperation with 9th F48 and is very promising for the future. With the use of modern methods, a wide scope of analysis and electronic systems of recording, and especially thanks to the participation of scholars qualified in all necessary fields and specialities, it is hoped that there will be progress in the excavations, the limitation, study, and potentially also the presentation to the public of the Theban Mycenaean palace remains and the upper stratigraphic also layers. Progress is also made at the same time in the field of conservation and publication of finds from past and recent research projects. Since the first excavations of 1906 until the most recent one on the top of Cadmea in 2008. contributions by INSTAP and other funding research institutions and private who understand the importance and difficulty of our goal are in this point decisive for the present and future of our research. The excavation trenches, we see the room of the treasure to the left and the new trench to the right, are 6 meters depth into the city's active center with its diachronic and continuous habitation, and are exceptionally difficult and dangerous to dig, as well as prohibitively costly, while our success depends on a combination of parameters and factors. The excavation results of last year's research will be announced as planned next May in Athens. Our goal and prospect have been and still are the systematic investigation of the central Palatial complex, whose 3 sides have been lately, we can see somehow, defined to a certain degree, as well as the investigation of its annexes, and in particular of the complex we have seen before, in bad, of course, situation of the so-called weaponry. It is true that from time to time, very few central parts and more annexes to the great Palatial complex have been successfully investigated, so many as in no other known Mycenaean center or fortified citadel. Here was the famous treasury. I excavated, continuing the external wall, and we identified the part of the palace excavated in the 70s. This is only what we know about the center. The excavations at the beginning of the 20th century and the interpretation of the finds that aim to identify and define the limits of the palatial center of Thebes were since the beginning fragmentary, speculative, and mainly marginal, and remained so for decades. I have supported this view in my writings and lectures, while also recognizing and taking into account the conditions and the demands of those times. Workshops producing jewelry of high technical level, wall paintings and prestige objects, together with the large inscribed stirrup jars, almost certainly coming from Kydonia, today's Chania on Crete, ascribed to the ruins the glamour as well as the firm evidence of a well-built and rich palace. This was the so-called House of Cadmus. The question, however, of the evaluation and identification of its rooms, which were almost all used for storage and were mostly narrow and dark, did not concern much the excavator and was not reopened for decades. However, a little before the mid-60s, the increased building activity inevitably led to the unexpected discovery of important buildings, precious finds, and in fact, parts of the linear records. The then rescue excavations were undertaken at different spots of the Acropolis, you see there, and in fact outside the outline of the remains of the de facto perceived palace, the old house of Cadmus. The new evidence gave food to doubts concerning the evaluation of the up to then available evidence, and the belief that Thebes' Mycenaean palace should be redefined and redated. Almost all archaeologists remain faithful to Keramopoulos' main points and arguments. In fact, they tried to correlate them with the new, not yet digested, superb finds and evidence. In reality, however, a new monumental and rich in contents palatial building was coming to light and was hurriedly named New Palace, since the allegedly old one was taken for granted. A new interpretative approach on this subject first presupposes a good knowledge of the mechanism of Mycenaean linear B bureaucracy. As suggested by the analysis of the personal data coming from the best preserved linear B archive of Atano and Glianos, palaces had a huge manpower in their service. At Pylos, the recorded personnel includes about 8,000 persons. At Thebes, taking into account buildings and finds, the personnel might have been even bigger, estimated to around 10 to 12,000. Given this piece of evidence and line of thinking, a substantial number of buildings of palatial nature and function at Thebes, as for example at Mycenae and elsewhere, would be not only expected but also necessary. All palatial buildings, annexes, and complexes were, of course, endorsed with strictly distributed and classified functions and obligations, as we learn from the interpalatial study of tablets and especially of the Theban ones. Buildings are classified on the basis of their location, structure, and contents. Besides, according to the tablet text, they might have been offices, archives, workshops, redistribution rooms, storerooms, residences of officials, or offices of all categories. The palatial buildings were dispersed within the citadel, near and around the central complex. They altogether expressed the palace's status as an administration center, as an industrial and economic machine, which was certainly centralized and hydrocephalous, potentially also tyrannical in its socio-political manifestations towards its subjects living within or outside the walls. Therefore, the Palace of Thebes, similarly to other known palaces, is practically defined as a composite and multi-roomed building complex and administrative system at the same time and theoretically as the core of centralized bureaucratic system. Over my long year stay in Thebes, several palatial buildings were investigated. None of the above parts or annexes of the palace was of no importance. On the contrary, a few of them have produced archive texts written in linear B script, found at more than 6 different spots of the Acropolis. You can see them. The complex itself, which is mistakenly and now conventionally called the House of Cadmus, was a major component, a functional part of the palatial complex and system. However, after a lot of thought and study, I would like to assure you that the central core of the Palace of Thebes, with its so-called megaron, central court, archives, weaponries, spacious rooms, wall paintings, and all the other main components, is still buried under very deep deposits, which are almost prohibiting for any investigation. In the few and partly recovered rooms, 3 in total, you can see them, groups of linear B tablets and ceilings, these are the administrative centers, not the inscribed amphoras, of course, were found in this case, but not yet the central archives. The central building's northeastern corner, you see there, was excavated in the 60s against all reactions of people. The palace's treasury was discovered there and for the first time led to the diagnosis of its international overseas relationships and the monumentality of its construction and its rich wall painting decoration with intense argolic influences and similarities. During the last season of excavation and restoration of the street, there in the treasury and its neighboring pithoi room with the stocked pithoi, which were possibly full of goods, their remains have not yet been analyzed. This is our last discovery in 2005 with tablets 2. I personally was lucky to discover for the first time in both rooms archival texts of all administrative levels, tablets in the shape of small and large pages, and clay inscribed ceilings. It is obvious that this very small part of the central building is now established as an example of the main body of the Theban Palatial complex on architectural and administrative grounds. The wool workshop and storeroom to the southwest of the above rooms was erroneously identified in the 70s as the archive. The product wool is weighed and recorded in detail on tablets in advance of its distribution to sanctuaries as an offer and to the specialized workshop as staple. It is raw material to be processed. This room, with its specialized facilities and this small local archive of 16-leaf shaped tablets, offers the evidence for a well-known, especially from Knossos, but also from Thebes, major secondary production activity, the manufacture of textiles and its perfect bureaucratic organization within the palatial context. The most important, however, outcome of our recent explorations and observations and calculations at this point was that the strong western external wall, I showed you it before over on the top, of the central complex was clean and defined. I refer with some reservation, you can see the west wall, and the room of the treasure and my excavation this year. To the preliminary estimation of the width of the central palatial complex in comparison to contemporary at Pylos. The new 5-year-long program of field research, conservation, and study aims to the discovery of new epigraphic and archaeological evidence, destined to demystify the whole issue and precisely define and date the Mycenaean palatial complex of Thebes. In the following years, and as the work and study progress, we will evaluate the possibility and prospects of presenting the remains to the public and making them possible to visit in the future, which will raise issues of further expropriations in the already expropriated central block. It is finally proved that the focus of the expropriations at this point was successful. The support of the municipality of Thebes, of many Theban citizens and young volunteers, and the help we receive from donors and supporters not wishing to have their names publicized are vital for the continuation of the new program. Here, as I said, we have 3 generations, me and my wife, the young scholars, and the youngest volunteers. So this is the team. Coming now to the present and to the conclusion of my speech, I would like to focus on the general atmosphere in which our research has been conducted over these last years in Thebes, and imagine its prospects for the near future. as Greece is going through hard times and archaeologists are constrained to operate in unprecedented economic conditions. Over the last 2 years of my post as head of the service at Thebes, the pace of our work in the field was reduced dramatically due to the devastating economic crisis. However, at the same time, the archaeology of Thebes has never been better understood by scholars or better presented to the international public, thanks to the opportunities offered by the works in progress for the reopening of the newly extended and refurbished museum. The plans to open the latter to the visiting public are in advance. Thus, in the next few years, thanks to the lifeline of European Union's National Support Framework, ESPA, there will be mats in the museum's rooms to draw visitors to Thebes from Athens, Europe, and overseas. Online access will also help to make the museum's collections widely accessible. The last book is online, and in English too, you know. Lazis, referred by Sylvia before. And this volume is the edition and electronic publication of the volume, The Archaeological Museum of Thebes, in the Precious series, the cycle of the museums, with the financial support of the Lazis Foundation and FEG Eurobank. The volume was prized by the Academy of Athens on December 31, 2011. Better access to Theban antiquities can be achieved through the ministry's digital collection portal and the extension of the Google Art project to more first-class Greek museums except the Acropolis one. Art from Thebes can be made accessible to wider audiences worldwide, especially in the Americas, through a series of major loan exhibitions. In fact, 2 years ago, there was such an attempt to organize an exhibition for the current year, 2013, in the Onassis Cultural Center in New York. This proposal, albeit sponsored by the Columbia University too, has failed in its first steps. In closing, I cite from Archaeology of Greece 2012. Complex questions surround the practice of archaeology during an exceptionally difficult period in Greek history. Public policy in the area of culture will continue to be prominently debated, but while change is more likely to be felt in the medium term, it is worth drawing attention to infrastructure programs which have the potential to affect the way we all work. One such is the Registry of Archaeological Sites, Monuments and Properties, being developed alongside the regular land and woodland registries. Really a huge undertaking. This is not something that can be achieved quickly, but it will be a major resource. I could add from my experience that the question of archaeology in Greece online, given the costs and time lag of the appearance of Archaeologikon Deltion, must be solved soon in a practical and not expensive way. The publication, perhaps in parallel to the FASTI archaeology system, which has delayed for Greece so many years. I close up with some words written years ago by Hernando Momigliano. Too much historical research is being done by people who do not know why they are doing it, and without any regard to the limits imposed by the evidence. An improvement in this respect is both possible and desirable. Thank you for passing.
Well, thank you for this wonderful talk, very rich, with a lot of problems and issues exposed to us tonight. So thank you very much, including the latest results from your excavation. I'm sure you're going to take a few questions.
Really,
so
it's me excavating.
I can't see.
With Yannis Papas close here below, but it's me excavating and finding.
Okay, any questions?
First, Marco, about chronology, I suppose.
Vassilis, thank you very much for that splendid summary of the history of excavation in Thebes. I have a few very brief questions and then a story to share. I take it you now think that the center of the palace is at the top of the hill. Is that right?
It is the continuation of the treasure room. This is the strong and of the whole workshop.
On the spot.
A piece discovered. So we excavate in the central, yes, and as I say, speaking about the pillars, I speak about the central part. While here we had the possibility to have, it was a very spacious citadel. Mycenae had no space, so some houses, I strongly believe, belonging to the Palatial official administration were the ones out of the Acropolis. The Thebes had rooms, and the system worked with more. I don't say that everything is contemporary. This is not the question of this lecture, of course, to date or say. So I cannot say that the Simeonoglu's excavated part or Antonis Norgas, remember, critics and so on, were contemporary. Or even the Cadmeion. We will see the chronology of the central part and we'll decide which part goes here and there.
I noticed that there's a park, apparently, from the photographs near where you're excavating. I just wonder if there's any chance of future excavation in that area. Could the land be acquired?
We have some land for the 45 years program. Mm-hmm. Because I have the permit to excavate that part which is in the palace, which is free. Some buildings also old were expropriated in that piece, in that core. And I have also a piece in the so-called weaponry, the Oplothiki, where I found the archives, not central ones. And in the 60s were discovered weapons. I don't believe weapons for the army. I believe there were the so-called ceremonial weapons. This is the reason we have ivories decorated, I suspect, and some, how we called them, the trappings. Trappings. In real bronze trappings and in decorative ivory. So I imagine like some Etruscan, even chariots that were ceremonial. Mycenaeans, as you know, many time was spent of them to hunting and to ceremonies. I don't say religious, because this was the question of the interpretation of my tablets and so on. Not religious, ceremonies, continuously, that were mixed. You know, questions of unity of political and religious, an expression of politics, always, and so on. So this is what, at this moment, we can.
Now for my little story, if I may, sorry. 35 years ago, I spent, I think, 10 days at the American School of Classical Studies in Athens, my first visit, which I now have the misery to serve as chairman of the Board of Trustees. And on one of the days, somebody said, let's visit Thebes. I'd never been there. And we arrived and were greeted by, I guess, then Epimelique Sparopoulos, who said, 2 weeks ago, I found this remarkable tomb. Of course, the one we've just been discussing. And I've just yesterday finished clearing the entrance. Would you like to be the first people to see it? So we went in. And of course, I almost fell over. Because as I recall the entrance, first of all, there was a running spiral in the decoration, the fresco. And second of all, someone at the entrance, near the entrance to the main entrance to the tomb, looking as if he were greeting visitors in a flounced skirt. This has never been published. And,
it was left. The frescoes were left for years. Then it came others. And you remember probably also Corres was very angry about it continuously, that the frescoes were left there. But no one has done anything. I was very young then, a student in university, I remember. Fortunately, we have the sections, the designs. Someone observed that, strangely, there are German didascalie, German comments, yes, because they were done by a German architect then. Fortunately, we know something. Yes, you see.
And then he was already aware that there was a secondary entrance, and we saw it, you know, that higher up on the hill. But his theory was...
Absolutely, yeah, yes.
Yeah, his theory was that either there'd been an earthquake, which he thought there was some evidence, which closed the first entrance, or there'd been the first of the two Theban wars, maybe at the end of 382.
Willingly were opened, because two were the dead. And so this was a twin tomb with two entrances, because, yes, this is what he...
Yes, he later said that, but his first reaction
First,
was...
yes, he was very young, you remember.
Yeah,
he was 32 years old.
But still a serious question. Is it the case that, could it be the case that the main entrance collapsed either because of attack or earthquake, and then the sort of secondary tunnel from above was dug at a later date to gain access to the tomb, perhaps to loot it or perhaps for additional burial?
When it was excavated, a considerable part of the roof was preserved, and then was left to collapse because the porous, the situation is in the first one, the highest one, on top. This kind of porous, if it takes water for many years, goes down. Now we use the, how we call it, is a concrete special kind, which is used for technical words to granite, to, well, no, not an excellent probably material, but you have to reconstruct. Who knows? Why not one day?
Professor Stanton.
As well as being effectively the discoverer of palatial Thebes, you are also the man who first mapped out Mycenaean Boeotia, the geographical scope of the palace. Would you like to say a few words about that? Because it is so dramatic, I think, and it makes Mycenae look like a small provincial province.
The last meeting in Vienna, was thrown a doubt about our traditional vision, which a little bit completely Homeric, with the different kingdoms.
Yeah.
I don't know how many, 5 in Thessaly, in the area of Magnesia, 2 in Ithaca, in Kefalinia, my island, 3 parts, and in Argoli, 2, many. Dr. Ed and others supported the idea, which we sometimes, it was a kind of, how we say, homospondia, of
Confederation.
Or confederacy, something, but a greater, because this comes from dimensions with interrogative points, interrogation point, of the text of Hittites and so on about the famous Ahijava. And from something also we feel, you know, with frescoes, my colleague Boulotis and many other people, that we have probably something more. For Thebes, I supported the idea of a greater, of Boeotia as at least I don't believe that the tholos of orchomenos creates problems. Or even, I don't believe that we have evidence. Probably it existed for the Acropolis of Athens. That of course could be something, but this does not exclude that we can have Tyrins, Nauplia, Medea, Mycenae, I don't know how many others, other important places. Yes, this, Boeotia and some glimpses. We cannot only on the evidence of linear be Lamo, Ramon, Helicon. Eleon is a good point.
What about Evia?
You know, if you find the same name in two different Mycenaean archives, you cannot say, oh, absolutely, as someone, they are contemporary. If you find the Aravantinos family in the early Byzantine, no, late Byzantine times from Aravanda, and in Kefalinia, so you cannot say that this is contemporary. And on only the linear B documents, you cannot form hypotheses. But
I don't have any stories, but my question does follow on Malcolm's. Because the site of the palace, and indeed the entire Acropolis, is covered by modern buildings, what are your prospects for finding the archive? And because so much of the site is as much as 6 meters below the surface, what are your prospects for actually excavating?
Once I lectured in Urbino, and there was the wise and very aristocratic, I think he's alive still, Bruno Gentili. He told me, Vassilis, have you found the house of Pindar? I say, no, not yet. He said, Alexander the Great did not destroy it. Said, yeah. After Alexander. So in my very, very deep section, I found a very strong Hellenistic building. I was very, very lucky to find the Mycenaean walls on the edges of the, this is the reason I said many other factors could destroy your excavation. If I found a cross of Byzantine walls at a depth of 4 meters or Hellenistic in 5, as I found it, thanks God, on the edge of this very strong Hellenistic building, probably before the destruction or after the destruction by Caesar, I would lose my money and the money, and others' money too. But yes, I had no many finds this year, unofficially this year, but an excellent stucco pavement. I believe we are in a kind of court. Yes, if the treasury is in the corner, a little bit strange, but well protected, that corner has a foundation of 2 meters and known in Mycenaean. If this treasure, incredible treasure, was in the corner, we have possibilities to find the central archive. Or I am in the antechamber, anteroom, or somewhere. Yes, we will try this year to excavate still. I am not looking for precious objects. I cannot at this moment expropriate, and but anyway, this has been designed, but successfully projected this expropriation. We are in the central building, or in the central part. Local archives, and the ones I found at a distance out of the central building, certainly. were of a ceremonial character, were local deposits, as in the wool workshop was a local archive. I don't know if everything was burned and preserved, or but anyway, 16 tablets speaking about wool and containing names of divinities and of very humble workers, of the fullers of the wool. So it is a great hope.
Okay. Well, let us thank Professor Aravantinos once more for this wonderful talk.